My wife cheated with her ex and demanded half in the divorce. She didn't expect what I had on her. Hello, read it. If you told me a year ago that I'd be sitting here, questioning every moment of the last 11 years of my life, I would have laughed in your face. I was that guy, the one who thought he had it all figured out. A successful business, a solid marriage, a house I was proud to call home. The kind of life that makes you feel like you've won. And maybe for a while I had. But the thing about life is, you never see the cracks until it's too late. My name's Caleb. I'm 42, and for most of my adult life, I've considered myself a builder. Not just by trade, but by nature. I run a small construction company, something I started fresh out of college with nothing but a truck, a toolbox, and a stubborn belief that I could make something out of nothing. I built that business with my own two hands, brick by brick, just like I thought I was building my marriage. Olivia and I met when I was 30. I'd been working long hours trying to grow the company, and dating wasn't exactly a priority. But then she walked into my life, and it was like a switch flipped. She had this energy about her, magnetic, electric. People couldn't help but notice her when she entered a room. I certainly couldn't. We were married a year later. It was fast, but when you know, or at least that's what I told myself. In the beginning, it felt like everything just clicked. She brought excitement to my steady, grounded life, and I gave her stability in return. We balanced each other out. She pushed me out of my comfort zone. I gave her a place to land when the world got too chaotic. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but we made it work. Or at least, that's what I thought. The cracks didn't appear all at once. They were small at first, subtle enough to ignore. A missed dinner here, an unexplained expense there. Little things that didn't seem like a big deal in the moment, but slowly began to add up. I think it started about a year ago. Olivia's always been busy. She thrives on being in motion, juggling 10 things at once, but her schedule started to feel different, erratic. She began leaving the house earlier, coming home later. Her reasons vague and inconsistent. I've got a work meeting, she'd say. Or, I'm grabbing drinks with the girls. It all sounded normal enough, but there was something in the way she said it, like she was rushing to get the words out before I could ask too many questions. I didn't think much of it at first. I chalked it up to stress, the ebb and flow of life. We all go through phases, right? Times when work or friends or life in general takes over for a bit. I told myself it was temporary, but then she started staying out overnight. The first time it happened, I was worried sick. She was supposed to be home by 10, and by midnight, I still hadn't heard from her. I called her phone over and over, each unanswered ring making my chest tighten. Finally, around 1 a.m., she texted me, "Stayed at Kristen's. Phone died. We'll explain tomorrow." The explanation, when it came, was vague at best. She'd gone out for drinks with a friend, lost track of time, and decided it wasn't safe to drive home. Reasonable enough, I guess, but something about it didn't sit right. Kristen wasn't someone she spent much time with. In fact, I couldn't remember the last time she'd even mentioned her. But I didn't press. I told myself I was overthinking it. The second time it happened, the excuses were thinner. She'd been at a late work dinner, she said, and ended up crashing at a coworker's apartment to avoid driving tired. Again, plausible enough, but the details didn't add up. She couldn't tell me where the dinner was or which coworker she'd stayed with. By the third time, I stopped asking. It wasn't just the late nights. Other things started to change, little by little. She became glued to her phone, spending hours scrolling or texting, her face lit by the glow of the screen. I'd walk into the room, and she'd quickly lock it, tucking it out of sight like she didn't want me to see. When I asked who she was talking to, she'd wave it off. Work stuff. Or just catching up with an old friend. She started spending more money, too. Packages began arriving at the house almost daily. Clothes, shoes, high-end skincare products, even lingerie. I'd see the boxes stacked by the front door when I got home from work, but I never saw her wear any of it. At least, not around me. Her appearance changed as well. Olivia's always been stunning, but lately, it felt like she was putting more effort into looking good. New hairstyles, fresh manicures, gym sessions that stretched for hours. Again, not inherently suspicious, but it felt off, like she was preparing for something or someone that had nothing to do with me. I tried to push the doubts aside, telling myself I was being paranoid. But as the months went on, the distance between us grew impossible to ignore. We used to talk about everything: our dreams, our fears, the little details of our day. Now, our conversations felt like rehearsals, as if she were saying lines she'd memorized just to keep me from asking too much. She didn't laugh at my jokes anymore. She didn't ask about my day. Sometimes, when we were sitting at the dinner table, it felt like I wasn't even there. I remember one night vividly. She'd gone out again, leaving me alone in the house. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me, a cold beer in my hand. The house was silent, too big and too empty, the kind of quiet that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. I wanted to call her, to ask when she was coming home, but I didn't. What would be the point? She'd just give me another excuse, and I'd sit there feeling like a fool for asking. Instead, I sat there and thought about the man I used to be. The guy who stood at the altar 11 years ago, looking into Olivia's eyes and believing he'd found his forever. I thought about how naive he was, how certain. And I wondered if deep down he'd seen this coming all along. Because trust doesn't break all at once. It cracks slowly, until one day you wake up and realize it's gone. And right now, I can feel it slipping through my fingers, no matter how tightly I try to hold on. I don't know what changed, but after that night at the kitchen table, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was the silence of the house, or maybe it was the growing weight of all the little things I'd been ignoring. But I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I told myself I wasn't going to jump to conclusions. I wasn't going to accuse Olivia of anything without proof. I still wanted to believe there was an explanation, that all of this was some big misunderstanding. But the doubt had taken root, and once it's there, it spreads like wildfire. I started paying attention. The first thing I noticed was the inconsistency. Olivia's schedule was always packed, but her reasons for being out didn't add up. She'd tell me she was at a late work meeting, but when I casually mentioned it to one of her co-workers at a company barbecue, they looked confused and said there hadn't been any meetings that week. Another time, she claimed she was going to the gym after work, but when I checked her car later that night, her gym bag was still in the trunk, untouched. I wasn't looking for these things. They just started falling into place on their own, like puzzle pieces I didn't want to see. Then there was the phone. I'd always been the kind of guy who believed in personal privacy. I never went through Olivia's phone, not even when she left it lying around unlocked. It wasn't just about trust. It was about respect. But now, every time I saw her glued to that screen, typing away with a little smile on her face, I felt something tighten in my chest. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. She'd gone to bed early, leaving her phone on the kitchen counter. I stood there, staring at it, my hands practically shaking as I debated what to do. It wasn't locked. Olivia had never set up a passcode, something I'd always taken as a sign of trust between us. But now, that trust felt like a cruel joke. I opened her messages, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I told myself I was just looking for reassurance, for proof that I was wrong. But what I found wasn't reassuring. There were dozens of messages from names I didn't recognize, some of them innocent enough, co-workers, friends, but one name kept showing up over and over again. Aaron. My stomach sank. I didn't recognize the name, but the way they spoke to each other didn't leave much room for interpretation. The messages were casual on the surface, but there was an intimacy to them, a familiarity that made my skin crawl. Missed you today. Can't stop thinking about last night. When can I see you again? I stared at the screen, the words blurring together as my vision clouded with a mix of rage and disbelief. I wanted to believe I was misunderstanding, that there was some explanation I hadn't considered. But deep down I knew this wasn't innocent. I didn't confront her right away. My first instinct was to storm into the bedroom, throw the phone on the bed, and demand an explanation. But I stopped myself. If I confronted her without a plan, without solid proof, she'd just find a way to talk her way out of it. Olivia was good at that, turning things around, making me feel like I was the one in the wrong. So instead, I started documenting. I took screenshots of the messages, sending them to my own phone and deleting the evidence from hers. I checked her call logs, noting the frequency of her conversations with Aaron. I even looked at her calendar, finding gaps in her schedule that matched the time she claimed she was working late or going to the gym. It wasn't just about catching her in the act. It was about protecting myself. If things went south, and I was starting to think they would, I needed to be prepared. But as the days went on, I found myself sinking deeper into a hole I couldn't climb out of. Every time she left the house, I wondered if she was going to see him. Every time her phone buzzed with a notification, I wondered if it was him on the other end. It was like living with a ticking time bomb, waiting for it to explode. And then it did. One night, she came home late, later than usual. She was wearing a dress I didn't recognize, her hair freshly styled, the faint scent of expensive perfume clinging to her skin. I asked her where she'd been, trying to keep my voice steady, but she barely looked at me as she tossed her purse onto the counter. "Work dinner," she said, pulling off her heels. My eyes drifted to her neck, where I noticed a faint red mark just above her collarbone. It could have been nothing, a bug bite, a scratch, but it wasn't. I knew what it was. My blood ran cold as I stared at her, my mind racing. I wanted to confront her right then and there, to demand the truth. But instead, I just nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat as she disappeared into the bathroom. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up in the living room, the darkness pressing in around me as I replayed everything over and over in my head. The missed dinners, the vague excuses, the messages from Aaron. It all pointed to the same conclusion, no matter how much I wanted to deny it. My wife was cheating on me. The realization felt like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of me. I sat there in the silence, staring at the wedding photo hanging on the wall. 11 years of marriage, and this is where we'd ended up. But as the shock faded, it was replaced by something else, determination. I wasn't going to let her take me for a fool. If she wanted to tear down everything we'd built together, I wasn't going to go down without a fight. Because this wasn't just about me. It was about the life I'd built, the business I'd worked so hard to grow, the house I'd poured my blood, sweat, and tears into. If Olivia thought she could have it all while stabbing me in the back, she was in for a rude awakening. The morning after Olivia came home wearing another man's perfume, I stood in the kitchen staring at the half-empty coffee pot, trying to decide what to do next. My mind was racing, cycling through anger, disbelief, and a gnawing sadness I couldn't shake. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together too clearly to ignore now. The red mark on her neck, the messages from Aaron, the endless lies wrapped in paper-thin excuses. My wife was cheating on me, and if I didn't do something about it soon, I was going to lose more than just my pride. That's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't just break your heart. It shakes your foundation, makes you question everything you thought you knew. I kept replaying moments in my head, wondering how long this had been going on. Was it months? Years? Had she ever really been mine? Or was I just too blind to see the truth? I knew I couldn't sit still. For the next week, I became a man with a mission. Olivia thought she had me fooled, thought she was getting away with it. But I was done playing the oblivious husband. I needed more evidence, not just for my own sanity, but for the storm I knew was coming. She didn't know I'd already taken screenshots of her messages with Aaron, or that I'd started tracking her work dinners and gym visits. She didn't know I was piecing together a timeline, one lie at a time. What she also didn't know was that I'd spoken to a lawyer. It was a quiet meeting. No fanfare, no dramatic declarations. Just me sitting across from a guy in a suit who laid out my options in stark, cold terms. He didn't sugarcoat it. If Olivia wanted a divorce, she'd likely come for half of everything. The house, the business, the savings account I'd spent years building. The thought of her taking all that, especially after what she'd done, made my blood boil. But the lawyer had a solution. "Document everything," he said, sliding a blank notepad across the desk toward me. "Emails, texts, photos. You need proof, not just of the affair, but of the lifestyle. Spending habits, financial inconsistencies. Anything that shows she's been draining the marriage while living a separate life." I took the notepad home and started filling it that night. The first thing I did was check our joint bank account. Olivia had always handled most of the day-to-day expenses, and I'd never felt the need to look too closely. But now, as I scrolled through months of transactions, a pattern started to emerge. Dinners at upscale restaurants I'd never been to. Hotel charges in the city. Spas, designer boutiques, and rideshare trips that didn't match her usual routine. It was all there, laid out in black and white. My stomach churned as I added the expenses to my growing list of evidence. This wasn't just about the affair anymore. Olivia wasn't just cheating on me. She was funding her double life with our money. I kept digging. I checked her email next, combing through archived messages she probably thought I'd never see. Most of it was harmless. Work memos, newsletters, but buried between the mundane was a series of emails to and from Aaron. The messages were worse than the texts. They were longer, more intimate, filled with details that made my chest tighten and my fists clench. She wasn't just sneaking around with him. She was confiding in him, sharing pieces of herself that I thought were mine alone. The emails confirmed what I'd been dreading. This wasn't just a fling. It was an affair. I saved everything, every damning word, and backed it up on a flash drive. Then I hid the drive in the bottom drawer of my desk, under a pile of old invoices I knew Olivia would never touch. By the time I was done, it felt like my entire marriage was sitting on that drive. Every lie she'd told, every moment she'd stolen from me, every betrayal laid bare. But the more evidence I collected, the more I realized how little I actually understood about the woman I'd married. Who was Olivia, really? Was she the vibrant, ambitious woman I'd fallen in love with? Or had that been an act all along? Was Aaron her first affair, or just the first one I'd found out about? I felt like I was trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing, and every answer I uncovered only raised more questions. The breaking point came when I discovered the hotel receipts. I'd been digging through our shared email account when I stumbled across a confirmation for a boutique hotel downtown, dated just a week earlier. Olivia had booked the room under her name, but the guest listed on the reservation was Aaron. My hands shook as I stared at the screen, the weight of the discovery pressing down on me like a lead blanket. This wasn't speculation anymore. It wasn't a hunch or a suspicion. It was proof. I printed the receipt and added it to my growing pile of evidence. The notepad, the screenshots, the bank statements, they all painted a picture of a woman who had checked out of our marriage long before I realized what was happening. But knowing the truth didn't make it any easier. Every time I looked at her now, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. She'd sit across from me at the dinner table, scrolling through her phone like nothing was wrong, and I'd wonder how she could live with herself. How she could lie to my face every single day without a flicker of guilt. I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The evidence was piling up, and the storm was coming. One night, as Olivia sat in the living room scrolling through her phone, I stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. She didn't notice me, didn't even look up. I thought about confronting her then, laying everything out on the table and demanding the truth. But I stopped myself. Not yet. The time would come, and when it did, I needed to be ready. I needed to make sure I had every piece of evidence, every ounce of leverage, because once the truth came out, there would be no going back. She thought she was getting away with it. She thought she'd outsmarted me. But she had no idea what was coming. I always thought that if I ever caught Olivia cheating or doing anything that would unravel the life we built together, I'd feel rage, the kind that makes you lose control. I'd imagine shouting matches, thrown accusations, maybe even me storming out of the house with no intention of coming back. But when the moment finally came, it wasn't like that at all. It was calm, controlled, cold. The night she came home from the hotel, I was waiting. I hadn't told her I knew. I hadn't hinted at it or given her any reason to suspect what was coming. I wanted to see how far she would go, how long she thought she could keep the lie alive. When she walked in, I didn't have to ask where she'd been. I already knew. I'd seen her enter the boutique hotel downtown, wearing a dress I'd never seen before, her hair freshly styled, and a look of purpose in her step. She didn't even hesitate as she walked through the revolving doors. The drive home after that had been quiet, the evidence burning a hole in my mind. There was no way to unsee it now. By the time she walked through our front door that night, everything was ready. The evidence I'd collected over weeks, the screenshots, the receipts, the late-night text to Aaron, all of it was laid out on the coffee table in neat, damning stacks. It was like laying a trap, and now the moment had arrived to see how she would respond. She noticed the papers almost immediately. There was a flicker of confusion, then recognition, and then something I hadn't expected, fear. Olivia wasn't someone who scared easily. She was confident, even arrogant at times, always one step ahead. But now, as she stood frozen in the doorway, I could see the realization settling over her like a heavy weight. Her routine had always been to shrug things off, to throw out a quick excuse and move on as though nothing had happened. But this time, there was no room for excuses. The receipts, the emails, the screenshots, they were all there, staring back at her like a jury handing down a guilty verdict. She sat down on the edge of the couch, hesitant, almost timid. It was a side of her I hadn't seen in years. The Olivia I knew, or thought I knew, would have taken control of the situation, spinning a story so quickly that I wouldn't have had time to process it. But now, she seemed cornered. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand. The silence between us stretched on, thick and heavy. She didn't say a word, but I didn't need her to. Her body language said it all. The fidgeting hands, the averted gaze, the way her shoulders slumped as though the weight of the evidence was physically pressing down on her. I thought I'd feel vindicated in that moment. I thought seeing her like this would make up for the months of doubt, the sleepless nights, the endless cycle of questioning myself. But it didn't. Instead, I felt empty. This wasn't just the unraveling of a marriage. It was the unraveling of a life. The woman sitting across from me wasn't the person I thought I'd married. She wasn't the vibrant, ambitious woman I'd fallen in love with 11 years ago. She was a stranger who had been lying to me for months, maybe longer. As I sat there, watching her grapple with the weight of what I'd laid out, I couldn't help but think back to the beginning, to the moments when I first noticed the cracks forming, the times I had pushed aside my doubts because I wanted so desperately to believe in us. I thought about the first time she stayed out all night, her excuse about crashing at a friend's place ringing hollow even as I convinced myself it was true. I thought about the late-night texts, the missed dinners, the money she had drained from our accounts to fund her double life. It was all there, playing in my mind like a highlight reel of every moment I should have seen this coming. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was what came next. I spent the next hour laying everything out for her. There was no shouting, no accusations, just facts. I told her about the messages I'd seen, the emails I'd saved, the hotel receipts that left no room for doubt. I told her about the bank statements that showed where our money had gone, the timeline I'd pieced together of her lies and betrayals. Her reaction was underwhelming. She didn't deny it. She didn't cry or beg for forgiveness. She just sat there, her expression shifting between anger and resignation. At one point, she tried to explain herself, but I didn't let her. I didn't want explanations. I didn't want excuses. What I wanted, what I needed, was to take back control. I told her I'd spoken to a lawyer. That seemed to catch her off guard. For all her scheming, I don't think she had expected me to prepare for this so thoroughly. She had been so confident, so sure of her ability to outmaneuver me, that the thought of me fighting back clearly hadn't crossed her mind. The lawyer had been clear. If Olivia wanted a divorce, she'd likely come after half of everything. Our house, my business, the savings I'd spent years building. The thought of her walking away with all of that after what she'd done was almost too much to bear. But now, as I watched her sit there, silent and cornered, I felt a glimmer of hope. The evidence I'd collected wasn't just proof of her infidelity, it was leverage. She had lied to me, stolen from me, and broken every vow she had ever made. And now, she would have to face the consequences. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I didn't sleep. After Olivia went to bed, if she even slept at all, I sat in the living room, staring at the evidence I had gathered. It felt like my entire marriage was sitting on that table, reduced to a collection of screenshots and receipts. The anger I had felt earlier was still there, but now it was tempered by something else, determination. Olivia had made her choices, and now it was time for me to make mine. This wasn't just about justice, it was about survival. The days after Olivia filed for divorce felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life. For weeks, I'd been preparing for this moment, documenting every lie, every betrayal, every dollar she'd siphoned from our accounts. But now that it had begun, the reality of it hit me in ways I wasn't expecting. The divorce petition was simple and cold. Olivia was asking for half of everything: the house, the business, and the savings account I'd spent years building from scratch. It was a bold move, but it wasn't surprising. Olivia had always been the kind of person who expected to win, who believed she could take whatever she wanted and leave the rest in her wake. At first, I felt an overwhelming wave of anger. After everything she'd done, her affair with Aaron, her lies, the months of deception, she still thought she deserved half of my life. It wasn't just insulting. It was audacious. But anger wasn't going to solve anything. I called my lawyer the same day I received the papers, and we spent hours going over every detail of the case. He was methodical, calm, and strategic, the perfect counterbalance to the chaos that Olivia had brought into my life. He laid out my options, pointing out the strengths in my case and the weaknesses in hers. The evidence I'd gathered was damning. The screenshots of her texts with Aaron, the receipts for the hotel rooms, the bank statements showing how she'd been using our money to fund her double life. It all painted a clear picture of infidelity and financial misconduct. My lawyer assured me that we were in a strong position, but he warned me that the process would be long and grueling. Olivia wasn't going to give up without a fight. The first mediation session confirmed that. We sat across from each other in a sterile conference room, with our lawyers acting as intermediaries. Olivia looked calm, composed, and confident, as though she hadn't just tried to blow up my life. But her confidence faltered the moment my lawyer laid out the evidence. The hotel receipts were the first blow. Olivia's lawyer tried to argue that they were irrelevant, that her personal life had no bearing on the division of assets. But then came the financial records, the dinners at restaurants I'd never heard of, the shopping sprees, the spa days, and the rideshare trips that didn't match her supposed schedule. It all told the same story. Olivia had been using our joint finances to support her affair. For the first time, I saw real uncertainty in her expression. The turning point came when my lawyer brought up the timeline. Using the messages I documented, he laid out a detailed account of when and where her infidelity had occurred, tying it directly to the periods when she claimed to be working late or out with friends. It was irrefutable. By the end of the session, Olivia's confidence had been replaced by frustration. She barely made eye contact with me as we left the room, her posture stiff and defensive. Her lawyer had tried to salvage what he could, but the damage was done. Over the next few weeks, the battle continued. Olivia's initial demands for half of everything began to shrink as the weight of the evidence mounted. My lawyer pressed hard on every point, challenging her claims to the house, the business, and the savings. With every argument he dismantled, I felt a growing sense of relief. But it wasn't just about winning. It was about reclaiming control. For so long, I'd felt like a passive observer in my own life, watching as Olivia spun her web of lies and made decisions without my knowledge. Now, for the first time, I was taking back the narrative. The day the divorce agreement was finalized was both a victory and a loss. Olivia didn't get the house. She didn't get the business. And while she walked away with a small settlement, it was a fraction of what she demanded. The rest, the life I'd built, the future I'd envisioned, remained intact. But there was no joy in it. As I sat in the empty courtroom, staring at the signed papers in front of me, I couldn't help but feel a sense of mourning. This wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the end of the life I'd believed in, the version of myself I'd built around the idea of us. Olivia moved out a week later. She took her clothes, her shoes, and a few personal items, leaving the house eerily quiet in her absence. I didn't say goodbye, and neither did she. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into rebuilding. The house, once a source of tension and doubt, became a canvas for my newfound independence. I repainted the walls, replaced the furniture Olivia had chosen, and even started a small garden in the backyard, a project I'd been putting off for years. Every change I made felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. The business, too, became a refuge. It had always been my pride and joy, but now it felt more important than ever. Every project I completed, every client I worked with, was a reminder of what I'd accomplished on my own. But rebuilding wasn't just about the physical changes. It was about coming to terms with what had happened, accepting the pain, and using it to move forward. There were nights when the weight of it all hit me like a wave, when the memories of what Olivia and I had shared felt like a knife twisting in my chest. But those moments grew fewer and farther between, replaced by a quiet determination to rebuild my life on my terms. Months later, I heard through mutual friends that Olivia and Aaron had split. Apparently, their affair hadn't survived the transition to a real relationship. Part of me felt vindicated, but mostly I felt relief. Their failure was no longer my problem. Looking back, I don't regret how I handled it. Olivia's betrayal had shaken me to my core, but it had also forced me to confront the truth about myself, about my priorities, and about the kind of life I wanted to live. The man I was 11 years ago, the man who stood at the altar, believing he'd found his forever, might not recognize the person I am now. But I think he'd be proud. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just the story of a marriage falling apart. It was the story of learning to stand up for myself, to take back control, and to build a future I could be proud of. And for that, I'm grateful.